The day I decided to destroy Ethan Cole, the sky was painfully clear, one of those crisp mornings that almost dared you to feel hope. I remember thinking how wrong it looked, how unfairly beautiful the world could be while everything inside you burned to ash. Ethan had been my mentor, my business partner, and, at one point, my closest friend. We had built our company together from nothing to ambitious nobodies with matching hunger and sleepless eyes. And for a while, it was perfect. Money poured in, clients worshipped our results, and success tasted almost sweet enough to hide the poison underneath. But betrayal doesn't announce itself. It seeps in quietly, disguised as trust. It started with small things, calls I wasn't copied on, meetings I wasn't invited to, whispers that died when I entered the room. Then came the real blow of forged documents, my signature printed neatly at the bottom of deals I never approved. Suddenly, I was the face of corruption in my own company, and Ethan was the savior who rescued it from my supposed greed. He stole everything: my work, my reputation, my future. Overnight, I became a pariah. My accounts were frozen, my name blacklisted in every major firm, my fiancée gone. She didn't even say goodbye. She just disappeared, probably with one of Ethan's charming text messages still glowing on her phone. That was the day I learned what power really meant. It wasn't about money or status. It was about control, and Ethan had taken every last drop of mine. So I left town, vanished like the scandal he painted me as. But I didn't break. I rebuilt. I watched. I waited. For 2 years, I studied him from afar, his patterns, his weaknesses, the lies he built his empire on. By the time I came back, I wasn't the same man who left. I was quieter, colder, sharper, and I wasn't here to forgive him. I was here to make sure Ethan Cole never forgot my name again. I didn't rush. I had learned the hard way that haste makes mistakes, and mistakes are the only currency that could buy me trouble. For 2 years I'd watched Ethan move through rooms like a man who had never been taught the weight of consequences. He smiled, took credit, and let other people clean up the scraps. That arrogance became the map I followed. First thing I did was erase myself from the story he told. If he had painted me as a villain, then the villain had to vanish for the world to accept any new truth. I closed accounts, folded companies into shell entities I controlled through layers of trustees and proxies. No dramatic gestures, just legal paperwork and the kind of patience that feels like burying a seed and waiting a season to call it a tree. When the press finally stopped breathing down my neck and the lawsuits cooled, I disappeared into the background. It was easy to move when nobody wanted to remember your name. Then I listened. I watched his rhythms until I could hum them. The places he met clients, the nights he drank, the friend who always answered his texts at 2 in the morning. Patterns are vulnerable. They are predictable. And predictability is the handprint of every man who thinks himself untouchable. Why Ethan slept in a bed bought with my blood and sweat. I built a lattice of tiny, invisible levers. I rebuilt the network I'd once burned, not with the naive trust I'd once given freely, but with favors called in like I was. Small debts, held by people who liked their privacy and their wallets. An old vendor he'd cheated in a chase for a quick margin. An investor who'd been stiffed and told to wait for the next round. They didn't need my story. They needed a means to recoup, and I gave them a method that would feel like justice. Technology was my friend. Not the shiny half of it, the glossy dashboards and press releases, but the underside: logs, timestamps, metadata. I learned how to read the invisible ink of digital life. I hired a programmer, a ghost in a hoodie who could reconstruct a timeline of messages and then make them say just enough to be believable, but not legal suicide. I paid him with untraceable transfers and an unspoken promise: keep your mouth shut, or your own records will start to look interesting. Reggie, a private investigator with a bad back and a clean conscience, became my eyes on the ground. He was the kind of man who could point a lens at a window without making it look like a crime. He shadowed Ethan on business trips, photographed late-night dinners, logged car plates, and cataloged routines. When I got the first set of photos of Ethan and a client laughing under dim lights, hands dangerously closed, the thrill I felt was cooler than I expected. It wasn't pleasure. It was proof that my patience could become inevitability. But proof alone isn't punishment. I needed leverage. I needed to press and make a response look like an error rather than a weapon. So, I began the craft I'd always admired in other men who moved quietly. The art of plausibility. I seeded doubt first. A whispered question here to a junior partner. Have you ever wondered why he signed off on that vendor? And a gently placed document there to a procurement manager. I thought this invoice needed a second look. Nothing damning. Just a series of administrative irritations that multiples into a headache. People notice when the machinery catches. They start to keep receipts. They start to ask for emails. Someone who has been cutting corners will be the last person to notice the ledger tighten around their neck. At the same time, I rebuilt an alibi for myself. The old me of the man who wrote the code and sat in the conference room had to be beyond reproach. I scrubbed public traces, archived old correspondence, and left the neatest trail I could, audited, notarized, and impeachable. It had an odd calming effect, like wearing armor that you also paid for with sleepless nights. If anyone ever looked for me, they would find an irregular who'd been wronged, not an avenging phantom. The emotional work was the hardest. I learned to look at him without the flaring flood of hate that used to make me clumsy. In meetings I smiled while my palms sweated. At events I clapped the loudest when he spoke. I became the man who appears generous because he can afford to be. That kind of generosity disarms people. It makes them live as they always have, exposed and believing it's safe. Then I struck in small economic ways. A vendor who had trusted Ethan suddenly received an anonymous email about unpaid invoices. A client got a polite message asking them to verify recent charges. I arranged for a compliance firm to run a routine-sounding sweep. They found anomalies in accounts Ethan touched. The anomalies were subtle: a duplicated invoice here, a misallocated payment there, but a pattern emerged when the right eyes looked. Finance doesn't care about drama. It cares about numbers. Numbers, properly arranged, tell a story with a gravity all their own. But the sweetest move was personal. People carry soft spots they never advertise. Their lovers, their old friends, the little vulnerabilities they tuck into private messages. I acquired one of those vulnerabilities the same way a surgeon takes a pulse, quietly and with clinical interest. The details are private, and they should stay that way. But what matters is this: when you know the chord that makes them flinch, you can play it and watch them unravel. I made sure there were no fee tricks. No public shout. I preferred the slow erosion, the investor who suddenly asked for reconciliations, the client who requested a binding audit, the partner who tried to distance himself as if he had always resented Ethan. Each step fed the next. A man like Ethan collapsed by losing the scaffolding he'd leaned on, not by being kicked through the front door. People fall because the hand under their feet is removed, not because someone drags them down. 2 months into the plan, his first real stumble happened the way I predicted. A payment went missing, and the vendor called publicly. Ethan's tone shifted. Arrogance curdled into a brittle scramble. That was when I tested the thing I feared most: my own reaction. I watched him in the press, the lines on his face deeper than they'd been a year ago, and I felt nothing. Not the savage satisfaction I'd imagined, not the lightness some betrayals promise. Just a cold acceptance that the shape of my life had changed, irrevocably, because I had allowed it to. The final sequence was still ahead. I kept it folded in my pocket like a letter you wait for the right train to open. There would be a moment, not loud, not cinematic, when everything would tie up and the last of his roots would be loosed from the soil. I would not celebrate with champagne. I would simply close a drawer, breathe, and see how the city handled the silence I'd made. Because revenge at its most honest is not a scream. It is a method. It is a set of choices made slowly enough to feel like inevitability, cruel enough to be fair. And when the last piece fell into place, people would point and say it was karma, bad luck, or corporate mismanagement. They would never know the hand that tucked the dominoes and set them to fall. The doubt had done its work like frost, invisible at first, then cracking the foundation until things shifted. But frost doesn't finish. It only weakens. I wanted the break to be clean. I wanted the kind of failure that leaves no comfortable excuses. The kind that makes a man look in the mirror and not know the face staring back. So I did what I always do when I need precision. I cut through the noise and went for the source. Ethan's ego lived into places, the boardroom and the inbox. He curated both like trophies. He loved the sound of his name in a sentence and the way numbers bent obediently around his smile. If you remove the applause and scramble the numbers, you make a man naked before his peers. I began dismantling both. I sent a discreet tip to one of the largest clients, someone who'd once hung on his every sentence. The email was short and professional, framed as a compliance question. Can you confirm invoice hash? We're reconciling accounts and noticed an unusual routing. Nothing accusatory, just a request. It landed on the desk of a methodical woman who liked things that lined up. She asked, they checked, and the duplicate appeared like a blemish on pristine skin. At the same time, I introduced a tiny corruption into the project database, a timestamp shift that made a payment appear to clear before a service had been rendered. Small things like that look like human error until someone finds the pattern. Patterns don't care about charm. They care about consistency. When 3 independent checks began to point to the same idiocy, the narrative stopped being maybe this happened and became we have a problem. Ethan's first instinct was PR. He posted a smooth update, smiled for a camera, and promised transparency. That was his muscle memory, a deflect with charisma. But transparency requires documents. Documents require audits. Audits require auditors. Auditors love trails. Trails are proof. I turned his muscle memory into the mechanism of his undoing. People started to call. Not the harsh calls of the angry, but the softer ones of disappointed investors. Can you look into this personally? One asked. We've always had faith in you. Another emailed, the subtext clear, faith requires results. The warm chorus that had sustained him thinned into a few cold, clinical questions. He answered them with crystallized performance, but when facts are requested, performance means little. Meanwhile, I tightened smaller screws. I anonymously tipped a whistleblower hotline about unusual vendor routing. I arranged for a late-night server scan that flagged an old backup with overwritten authorization logs. No single item was damning. But when a string of innocuous errors lines up in sequence, even the kindest boards of directors start to wonder about negligence, incompetence, then, inevitably intent. Ethan began to show cracks. He stopped sleeping. His once irrepressible charm turned brittle. He flinched at texts. He started delegating like a man trying to be everywhere and there for nowhere. People who'd been loyal because it was convenient stepped back when convenience became risk. Board members I thought would defend him called for a special review. The company lawyer, a man whose face never flushed, requested a meeting to clarify recent entries. But logistics and spreadsheet anomalies are not the only vectors of collapse. Reputation is social networks of favors and intimacies that can be eroded with the right pressure. I drew a line through the person he trusted most, the guy who wrote his endorsements, the mentor who'd introduced him to investors. I fed that man a quiet fact about a shady transaction. The mentor checked his own account, some minor irregularities, and, with the clinical ethics of a person who sells reputations, began to distance himself. One less voice in his corner became 2, then 3. I also started to play with memory. People neuter evidence by forgetting. I weaponized memory by reminding. Little details appeared in the right inboxes, a copy of an old invoice, a screenshot of a message thread, a calendar invite with a note that now read differently in the presence of audit. Evidence doesn't lie. Perception does. When you assemble perception carefully, the evidence doesn't need to be loud, it simply sits there as a quiet consensus. Consensus kills charm. And then I went personal. Ethan's relationship with the coup had always been a quiet arrangement, a handshake and a drink. An unspoken agreement to split risk and polished image. I sent a carefully curated file to the coup emails that suggested he'd been kept at arm's length when decisions went sideways. A ledger with lines that implied he'd been left out of certain disclaimers. I didn't force anything. I only suggested that answers would be helpful for the board. The coup, who'd once laughed with Ethan at parties, suddenly found loyalty inconvenient. In a week, the CEO's tone went from defensive to solicitous. He asked the tough questions in meetings that Ethan used to own. The cracks widened. There were moments when the humane part of me, the part that remembered nights of cheap beer and building blueprints on napkins, forced me to pause. I saw the strain on his face, a man unraveling in real time. But those flashes were brief. What replaced them was an understanding that he'd made his choices. He'd gambled with my name, with the lives of the team that believed in both of us. His reckoning was not a theatrical moment for me to savor. It was a necessary correction. The quietest weapon I used was the longest, patience. While he scrambled to patch one hole, 2 others opened. The ecosystem of his life of vendors, investors, partners began to rearrange itself with clinical efficiency. He lobbied, begged, and resigned blame. He tried to buy time with explanations and admissions that landed like wet paper. Every explanation he gave was a map for me to test further. If he said the duplication was a software glitch, I introduced a second glitch in another system. If he blamed a vendor, I produced documentation that showed the vendor was as surprised as anyone. By the time the audit committee convened, the case against him was less about singular acts and more about a pattern. Patterns are the language auditors speak. They're unemotional and implacable. I supplied them with a dossier that read like a biography of negligence: dates, times, duplicated entries, corrected figures, and signatures. It was boring to read and devastating in effect. The committee called him in. He came in the way men come to confession, a mixture of hope and protest. I watched him from the gallery, pulse steady, hands folded. There's a particular cruelty in being calmly present while someone you've known pleads. I felt none of the old nostalgia. I felt the cadence of inevitability. He left the meeting with a suspended title and an interim board stepping in. The press, always hungry for a narrative, framed it as corporate mismanagement. Some accused him of incompetence. A few, far fewer, whispered about malfeasance. He tried to speak, to reassure, to promise reform. The words felt hollow because the ledger rarely lies. That night he visited the old office late, pacing where we used to sit and plot our ascent. He called my name once through the floor, through the echo of the building. No plea came through the phone later when I didn't answer. He sent one message the next morning: "If there's something, tell me. Let's fix it." I read it, let the words hang, then deleted the thread. I had reached the place I wanted. The scaffold that held him up was gone. He was not humiliated in a single glorious act. He had been worn down, his allies evaporated, his instinct to charm replaced by a frantic search for footing. The city that once celebrated him now watched with the cool curiosity of vultures circling. There remained one thing: the final act. Not a public spectacle, not a blow to his body or lineage, but a tidy closing that would ensure he could not re-emerge as anything other than the man he'd proved he was. I had the plan sketched in fine ink. It was merciless in its efficiency and private in its delivery, the way real punishments are. For now, I let the city do its work. It was time to wait for the quiet collapse to become complete. He stopped being a man at the helm and became a man on driftwood. That's the cruel difference, not that he failed, but that everything that had kept him afloat abandoned him one by one. And there was nothing left he could throw himself at. The board convened in the glass room that used to feel like stage lights and applause. Now it felt like an inquest. They read the documents I'd curated with the kind of clinical attention that removes dignity from a person without ever raising its voice. Every line I had fed them, duplicates, misroutes, and signed approvals, sat on the table like evidence that didn't flinch. They didn't have to say much. The silence did the work. The questions that followed were small, precise, fatal. Ethan tried to fight. He always had that talent, a quick smile, practiced shrug, and ability to find the human corner of a room and make it forgive him. But charm doesn't stitch paper into truth. Charm doesn't unscramble timestamps. Charm can't put back the money that never went where it should have. For once, his repartee was thin. The words he used were heavier than he'd ever intended them to be. He spoke about oversight and human error and the speed of growth, the platitudes that managers trotted out when their hands were caught in the till. At the meeting's end, they asked him to step aside pending an independent investigation. He left under a polite clap. People who'd once toasted his wins now averted their eyes. The office that had sung his name was mute. I watched him walk through the hall like a man in slow fog, and for a moment I felt something akin to pity. It was brief. It passed, replaced by a steady flame of purpose I could not know how to put out. Outside, the press had smelled blood. Journalists who used to smile at his jokes on panel nights now asked him questions with pens poised like scalpels. Investors who'd once sent congratulatory messages quietly demanded reconciliations and audits. The same people who had raised champagne to his future now asked for documentation of the past. That pressure compresses a person. They either compact into something honest or they crack. Ethan cracked. He started to misspeak in public, contradict previous statements. He canceled interviews, then agreed to them, and then canceled again. His world narrowed to a series of defensive gestures. Each misstep widened the gap between what he wanted to be and the man his ledger said he was. And while the public pressure was loud, the private pressure was worse. I watched as partners told him they had to reassess exposure. One by one, the calls dried up. A mentor who once protected him sent a curt message, for the board's sake. Keep a low profile. It read like a funeral notice where the pallbearer had been paid to look the other way. At home, his life was not public spectacle but quiet decay. Where he used to come back with bottles and big promises, he now returned with silence and a bag of takeout, eyes hollowed by sleeplessness. Megan left his side in stages. First dinners alone, then weekends she didn't come home. She took what she could, the linens, the photos, the small things that announce a life has been packed away. She left a note once, brief, polite, empty of warmth, and then closed the door. That hurt him more than the headlines. People can swallow shame if it's abstract. They cannot live with the intimate proof of abandonment. The nights when he tried to sleep were filled with the sound of his own breathing and the faint, accusatory echo of every person who had trusted him. But my plan was never merely to dismantle what he had. That felt too easy and too small. I wanted a finality that meant he could not return to the warm light of business dinners and easy applause. I wanted his name to sit in the ledger of the city as a cautionary footnote. So I moved to the last phase, the lock. The lock was subtle. It was a set of documents that, once in the right hands, made restoration of his position legally and reputationally impossible. I sent them to the external counsel, the same team companies hired to look untouchable. The file contained clean, corroborated evidence, bank statements with routing data, signed affidavits from vendors who remembered the wrong approvals, a timeline stitched together with metadata that could not be argued away. I didn't need to shout. The legal engine I engaged was built to take facts and grind them into policy decisions. Facts have a way of complying like weather. When the council read the file, they recommended a criminal referral. The terminology is precise. It signals that a matter is no longer contained within cubicles and quarterly reports. It pushes things into the slower, more dreaded machinery of subpoenas and prosecutions. I watched the board accept the council's recommendation with the same calm you'd watch a patient release an organ to save their life. It felt strange, almost antiseptic, a way institutions purged to continue. That night Ethan called me. It was a raw sound in his voice I'd never heard, not the practiced charm but a man who learned how fragile the scaffolding that held him up really was. "We can fix it," he begged. "Tell them it was a mistake. Tell them it was me trying to cover something. Tell them anything." He sounded smaller than I'd ever seen him. I could have told him everything at that second, thrown the last domino to watch a very public implosion. Instead, I listened and let him talk himself into a tighter knot. There's a cruelty in silence I'd learned to wield as precisely as any blade. The following weeks were a slow unspooling of consequences. Investigators called. Former friends were subpoenaed for documents they hadn't realized were relevant. Headlines called him embattled, then under investigation, then with a brutal economy of language replaced. He tried to flee to smaller towns, to hide in anonymity, to restart with a different face. The city is not merciful to men who built their life on other people's trust. There are records that follow. There are bank trails. There are people who remember. In the quiet hours, long after news cycles turned to other scandals, I drove by his old apartment and watched the light go out for the last time. The place we'd all once pictured him in, a stylish, unbothered, and touchable, felt like a tomb with tasteful furniture. I felt a jolt of something I hadn't expected, not joy, not grief, but a disorienting emptiness. The victory I'd crafted had a hollow chord. It's a peculiar thing to build a life on the idea of justice and discover that the architecture you use to erect it bears your handprint just as clearly. I had taken what he took from me. I'd returned it with interest. But as the city swallowed his name and moved on, I realized the lesson I now carried: some debts, when paid, leave you poor in ways money cannot measure. There was one last act to perform: a small note, placed where he would find it if he ever returned. A quiet signature of the hand that had set these events in motion. I could have written fury. I could have written accusation. Instead, I wrote the truth as I saw it and left it like a fossil in the dirt. You thought loyalty was a commodity. You were wrong. I folded the paper, slid it into an envelope, and left it on the table at a cafe he used to frequent, 2 seats from the window. Then I walked away and let the world decide what to do with the rest. The clock had run its course. The die had been cast. What remained was the aftermath for him, ruin. For me, the knowledge that ruin looks the same from both sides. The world didn't end for Ethan Cole. It just went quiet. The headlines faded first, as they always do. Scandals burn hot, then die out when a newer tragedy replaces them. A few months after his official resignation, his name was buried beneath newer names, louder disasters. People forgot. The city moved on. But I didn't. I couldn't. I thought victory would feel like release, that once justice was served, I could finally breathe again. But revenge doesn't end with the fall. It lingers in the silence that follows. You start to realize that you've spent so long fighting someone else's shadow that you don't know what to do with the daylight. One night, I saw him again by accident. Or maybe fate's last cruel joke. It was raining, the kind of cold, relentless rain that drowns the world in reflections. I was leaving a meeting downtown when I caught sight of a man sitting on a park bench, hood up, hands trembling as he tried to light a cigarette. It took me a moment to recognize him. Ethan Cole, the man who had once been untouchable, was now barely a silhouette. His suit was wrinkled, his hair unkempt, and his eyes, those once glittering eyes, were hollow, empty. He didn't notice me. Or maybe he did, but chose not to look up. I stood there for what felt like hours, hidden beneath the awning of a coffee shop, watching him. Every instinct in me screamed for closure, to walk up to him, to say it, to tell him that I had done this, that I had been the ghost in his system, the storm behind his collapse. But then, I saw him take a deep breath and smile, just a small, broken, almost human smile, before the cigarette finally lit. And that was enough. For the first time in years, I felt the weight slide off my chest. Not because I pitied him, but because I understood something I hadn't before. Revenge isn't about making them suffer. It's about reclaiming the part of yourself they tried to destroy. Ethan's ruin wasn't my victory, my peace was. I walked away that night and didn't look back. I left the city soon after, rented a small place by the coast where no one knew my name, where the sound of the ocean was louder than my thoughts. Some days I write, some days I just sit and watch the tide erase footprints that don't matter anymore. Justice had been done. The scales had balanced. But it came with a truth I'll carry forever, that vengeance doesn't heal. It transforms. It turns grief into fire, love into weapon, and, if you're not careful, it burns everything, including what's left of you. Still, when the night gets quiet and the wind moves just right, I can almost hear his voice, laughing like he used to when we were young, before greed poisoned the air between us. And in those moments, I don't feel anger anymore. Just a strange, bittersweet gratitude. Because without Ethan Cole, I never would have learned how powerful silence can be.